I'm Arun Bhakta Shrestha, and I work as a senior climate change specialist and regional program manager for river basins and cryosphere program at ICIMOD. I have a PhD on earth sciences, specializing in climate change and its impact, and then masters in hydraulic engineering. The Hindu Kush Himalaya region is also known as pulse of the planet, which means it kinds of indicates how is the health of the world going on right now. It's kind of early indicator of climate health. In that sense, the Hindu Kush Himalaya has already experienced quite a lot of changes in the climate. The most distinct, clear indicator of climate change in this region has been the change in temperature. The region has experienced around 0.2 degrees Celsius of warming per decade in last 4 or 5 decades, which is quite significant and is comparable to the global average warming rate. And we have also seen that the temperature warming is also dependent on elevation, meaning as we go up, the warming rates are also higher, which is also important because in the higher altitudes we have glaciers and snow field. So higher warming rate can be quite impactful to snow cover and glaciers. And then there are, apart from average warming, there are a few special indicators, temperature indicators, and most of the warm indices are also showing increasing trend. Now that's about temperature, but when we think of another important variable of climate, which is precipitation, so far we do not see very strong indications of changes in precipitation, at least the annual total precipitation. And that could be because of lack of enough quality record as well. But what we have seen in precipitation is that extremes are increasing. And it seems like more and more as we go with time, the extremes are increasing. And also we have seen increase in variability of western disturbances, bringing in more snowfall in the western part of Hindu Kush Himalaya. So these are some of the primary climate change indicators which we have already seen in the Hindu Kush Himalaya. Because these are first indicators of change, and therefore to understand what's happening, I think it is important what's happening with the pulse of the planet. But then it's not only the biophysical indicators which are important. This region, the Hindu Kush Himalayan region, is host to a large number of people. The population living not only in the Hindu Kush Himalaya region itself, but the river basins, the 10 river basins which are fed by Hindu Kush Himalayan mountains. The total population in this region is around 2 billion, which is kind of 1/4 of the whole global population. So what happens here actually is quite important, impacting at least 1/4 of the global population. So it is really important to understand what's happening. When I say to understand what's happening, I mean the biophysical changes, but also socio-economic changes. I think these are two very important things that we need to understand. Probably the most visible and something that is beyond argument that it is because of climate change is the rapid change in glaciers in the Hindu Kush Himalaya. And indeed, the glaciers in our region are changing, shrinking very rapidly. And that change we have seen through our own eyes. Those people who have been in the mountains have seen this. So that's one change that has happened quite significantly. Now, with that change, we can actually see many different kinds of secondary impacts happening. Now, those glaciers are sources of our river systems, the 10 river system, glaciers together with snow cover. the rapid melting of glacier can actually change the hydrological regime, the flow regime of the river. And what is likely to happen is, in the beginning, for few decades, the flow is likely to increase, but then with the glaciers shrinking rapidly, the flow is likely to decline. Now this would probably impact more severely the headwater regions, the region which is directly downstream of the mountains, where the water is largely drawn from melting of snow and glacier. And it would also be very impactful in areas to the western part of Hindu Kush Himalaya, which are naturally arid, like the Karakoram and Hindu Kush, where the water in the streams are predominantly from melt water. So I think in those areas, the glacier change will be quite, impact will be quite significant. Whereas in the east, it is a lot of water is drawn from monsoon precipitation. So in the headwaters in the eastern region also probably it will be impactful. But as we go downstream, because of the contributions from rainfall and also from groundwater, the impact would be less. But then the impact of glacier change would not only be in the hydrology, but also in the hazard. For example, glacier change leads to formation and increase of many glacial lakes in the region. And in fact, in past decades, there have been formation and increase of many glaciers, and many of those, several of those glacier lakes can actually burst out and cause what we call glacial-led outburst flood. And those floods can be very devastating and damage quite a lot in the downstream region. That's one impact of climate change through cryosphere change. Now, due to change in the precipitation pattern and increasing extremes, both wet extremes and dry extremes, the floods and droughts are likely to increase in this region. And I think we have already seen quite a lot of increase in floods, landslides, but at the same time drought as well. So in combination, I think the issue of too much, too little water, which is present in present day, will be increasing. The issue of floods, flash floods, landslides, debris flow. I think there are indications that they are already increasing and likely to increase in the future. So altogether, this will have impact on almost all sectors: water resources, for example, agriculture, tourism, infrastructure development, health, and many others. Now, the analysis we have done so far, based on different kinds of models, both global scale models and regional scale models, indicates that the future is not going to be very much different in terms of warming. In fact, the projections are that the warming will continue and intensify in the future. And also the elevation dependent warming, meaning higher warming rates in higher altitudes, also will continue and intensify in the future. The projections are that by the end of the century, this region, the Hindu Kush Himalayan region, is likely to warm by at least 2 degrees Celsius compared to the reference period, or in extreme case could be as high as 5.5 degrees Celsius. So these are quite extreme scenarios and could have significant impacts. So these are quite serious projections, and when we translate it into impacts on glacier, these suggest that if the world manages to stabilize at 1.5 degree Celsius warming by the end of the century, which seems to be a very ambitious target, even with that ambitious target, the Hindu Kush Himalayan glaciers are projected to shrink by 1/3. So 1/3 of the glaciers are likely to melt away. But then if we go by current emission scenario, then 2/3 of our glaciers are likely to vanish. So these are quite serious kind of impacts. Now, the other variable, precipitation, is also projected to increase in the future. And depending on the models, it could range from as low as 4%, but as high as 12%. So, depending on how it goes, increase in precipitation could also lead to a lot of problems in the future. So, as I mentioned earlier, the region already is experiencing quite a lot of hazards. So, in the future, if the trend goes like this, it is very likely that those hazards are likely to increase both in magnitude and in frequency. But then the risk factors are also likely to change because the socioeconomic patterns are changing, population growth is happening, there are a lot of settlements, increasing in the downstream part. So, the hazard would have more impact in the downstream. So, both hazard and the risks are likely to increase in the future. So, maybe there could be some positive changes, for example, due to intensive melting. In some areas, there might be more water available, but then we have to know when and how much and where those water will be available. And if we can plan properly and we could actually manage them for positive change. In agriculture sector also, we could take some benefit, but then overall, it seems like the impact of climate change is likely to be more negative than positive. I think we have to look at it from the angle now of response, right? The changes are inevitable in some way. Even if we manage to, mitigate the greenhouse gas emission, the impacts are going to happen, because of the lifetime of greenhouse gases. So, to address those changes, adaptation, that's what I think is very important. Now, when we talk about adaptation, it is much harder, much challenging to adapt to variabilities than to, gradual change. So, I think the extremes, the variabilities would be more important for us than the gradual trend, increasing trend. Well, the extremes means there will be more wet spells and there will be more dry spells. It might be more stronger and more frequent, but that's what it is likely to happen. There will be more hazards in where there were not much hazards in the past, right? And the natures of hazards might change. So, the preparedness for these kind of surprises, I think, is very important. And therefore, I think, of course, to understand the hazard, to increase our capacity and ability to project, forecast what's likely to happen, in terms of floods, droughts, is very important. But also, how are we going to respond to it? Very sound response mechanism, based on, different access to services, access to, different response mechanism. For example, if the drought is going to increase more in the future, what the farmers needs to do? The farmer needs to have access to water when they really need it for, irrigating their crops. So, solutions which could be very basic at, ground level, at community level also matters. But also there could be larger schemes like irrigation schemes. So, that kind of, options being available with the community actually enables them to actually face those kind of stresses, those kind of surprises that climate change is likely to bring in the future.